I do think it's true that pastors are held in less esteem today than they have been in the past. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think one reason for that is because pastors have held themselves in less esteem or lower esteem than they have in the past. There has been, in my generation, prior to my generation, this desire for pastors to just sort of be one of the guys and to not see themselves as distinct because of what we are called to do. And I think that's been harmful to the reputation of pastors. I think another reason for that is the role that pastors used to play in being a sort of conscience of the culture, and the fact that we have stepped away from that. The fact that we used to be the thermostat in the culture. We used to be the ones who were sort of leading the way and helping the culture think about things from a worldview perspective, from a theological and biblical perspective. We've now sort of retreated into our own worlds and into our own kingdoms. We're now building things for ourselves, looking inwardly and not looking outwardly at the responsibility that we have to engage and impact culture. Here's what's interesting to me. You talk to people about pastors addressing political issues, and their immediate response is that the church doesn't have any business in the political arena. Now, that's a very new idea. You know anything about the history of America, the history of the church, you know that that's not been the case. We've always understood that as our cultures face these issues, that it's the church that's uniquely equipped to address these issues. But there's an irony there, I believe, in our context. And that irony is pastors stand up in their pulpits now in our culture and spout psychology left and right. And nobody ever says, hey, this is not the place for psychology. But why do we believe that it's not the place for politics, but that it's okay for it to be the place of psychology? I'll tell you why. Because the other side has been effective in causing us to believe in this mythological separation of church and state that somehow makes it inappropriate for the church to have any say in what it is that the state does or thinks or how the state acts. If the church is not going to speak to the issue of truth and be a herald for the state and point the state to where truth is, then what's the only other alternative? The only other alternative is that man finds the truth in himself or in his courts. That's an untenable position. We cannot allow it. The Bible does speak to every issue in life, and our political issues are informed by our theology. There's no such thing as a politician or a political issue that is not theological. You cannot do politics without theology. So we have to, break this false dichotomy. I realize that there are pastors out there who are hesitant, pastors out there who are nervous or perhaps even afraid. And what I would say to those men quite simply is, remember what we find in the scriptures. Remember what Paul said to Timothy. God has not given us a spirit of fear. That does not come from God. We have to be reminded of that. I think also that pastors are afraid because they're succumbing to this fallacy of the excluded middle, that either, I am a political activist who's not involved with or engaged with gospel ministry, or I'm a real pastor, who would never touch on those issues. There is another way. Again, these issues are biblical issues. And let me put it this way. Nobody would have 50, 100 years ago shied away from dealing with homosexuality in those passages in the Bible that deal with homosexuality. Nobody would have shied away from dealing with marriage in those passages that deal with marriage. And nobody would have said that those passages were somehow political. Well, now all of a sudden, the government comes in, walks onto our territory, and because the government has walked onto our territory, we now say that it belongs to them. Well, I say, as a Texan, that dog won't hunt. They don't get to do that. They cannot come into our territory and then say that we're wrong for speaking about it. You don't get to walk onto my land and then say that I'm wrong when I want to plant something in my own field. So I think that fear from pastors comes from the fact that we've sort of been co-opted in many ways. these issues are not just political issues. These issues are biblical, theological issues. But beyond that, even issues that are political issues have biblical and theological underpinnings. So you got a two-pronged problem. Number one, we're afraid of something that doesn't exist, that somehow these issues are political. But secondly, we're afraid of something that we should never be afraid of. Nobody's happy about the advance of, people who want to change the definition of marriage. Nobody's excited about, the advance of issues like abortion in our culture. However, we have to be excited about the fact that lines are being drawn so clearly, and that we have opportunities to enter into spiritual discussions with people like never before. And I believe we need to be equipped so that when those opportunities arise, we can use them as a launching pad for the gospel.